With this crowd that includes mature speakers. There's still the desire to always sit in the back of the class, and the front row is often underpopulated, so please feel free to move up. So good evening. I'm Brian Taylor. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Urban Planning, and I'm director of the Institute of Transportation Studies here in the Luskin School of Public Affairs. It's my honor to welcome you to the 10th Annual Martin Wachs Distinguished Lecture in Transportation, to be delivered this evening by Professor Joseph Schofer of Northwestern University. This lecture is held this year in conjunction with the annual meeting of the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies Advisory Board, several members of whom are in the audience this evening. If I look around, Gene Armbruster from LA County, Emily Castor from Lyft, Trent Lethko, an alum from Arup, Kurt Lurson, also from Houston Metro, an alum. Salita Reynolds was here. I'm just not sure who's out there right now. Robert Skinner, formerly of the Transportation Research Board. Jarrett Stolfitz, there in the back. Phil Washington, and several others were here for our meeting, and we're capping this with the lecture this evening. For those of you who worry about such things, if you would like to get AICP credits for attending this lecture, there is a sign-up in the back over here on this side. So this evening is a special one. It's the highlight of our transportation program for the spring. The Wachs Lecture is named in honor of UCLA and UC Berkeley Professor Emeritus Martin Wachs, who, along with his lovely wife Helen and his son Stephen, are here this evening over here. We have been blessed these past 8 years to have Professor Emeritus Wachs back in our midst at UCLA. Working with students on classes and working with them on research projects, all while doing so at a leisurely pace that it allows him to enjoy his retirement and for us to enjoy his presence here back at UCLA. Now, Professor Wachs, for those who may not know him, spent 25 years at UCLA on the planning faculty between 1991 and 1996. He served 3 terms as the head of the planning program. And in addition to being a prominent productive scholar of transportation policy and planning, he won numerous teaching awards while he was here, and he built a grateful and loyal coterie of former students, the ranks of which continue to swell to this day. I am one of those students. He moved north in the mid-1990s to UC Berkeley, spent a decade there as the head of the University of California Transportation Center and then the ITS system there. Upon his retirement, he moved down to Southern California and helped to launch a program at RAND before coming back to UCLA for these last few years. And one of the things that has happened is not only do we have a fellowship in honor of Professor Wachs, we have this lectureship which alternates each year between Berkeley and UCLA in his name. This started in 2006, and just quickly, the previous Wachs lectures have been Bent Fluberg from Aalborg University in Denmark, Tony May from the University of Leeds in England, Susan Hansen from Clark University, Alan Altshuler from Harvard University, Genevieve Giuliano from USC, May Po Kwan from the Ohio State University at the time, Edward Glazer from Harvard University, Patricia Mokhtarian, the last Wachs lecture here at UCLA from Georgia Tech, and Catherine Ross also from Georgia Tech. Now, tonight's speaker, Joseph L. Schofer, is the Associate Dean of Faculty Affairs and Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering in Northwestern's McCormick School of Engineering, where he has been a faculty member there since 1970. He holds a Bachelor of Engineering in Civil Engineering from Yale University in New Haven, an MS in Civil Engineering from Northwestern, and a PhD in Civil Engineering from Northwestern. So he's been teaching where he received his PhD degree, if you can imagine such a thing. Only a few of you will get that. So Professor Schofer has taught for 5 decades, and he has transportation students at all levels of practice in the academy. I understand that his teaching and engagement work includes a long-running podcast called The Infrastructure Show, which I'm sure many of you will be interested in seeing. I understand it was picked up by Netflix for another season.
I hope so.
So if you can see it on there. He's been very active in the Transportation Research Board for more than 40 years. So he's led transportation programs on data, planning, policy analysis, decision making. He's chaired 3 major policy studies, 6 TRB conferences, 2 task forces, and a partridge in a pear tree. He's a National Associate of the National Academies. He's received a life member of the American Society of Civil Engineers, and he has been awarded the Institute of Transportation Engineers Wilbur S. Smith Distinguished Educator Award. He is, in other words, a truly distinguished academic. A bit about his research. It's focused on transportation policy, including the understanding of decision-making for transportation and other infrastructure systems, investments, operations, and the use of data and information, and the sustainability of key data programs, the management of disruptions due to severe weather and infrastructure failures, and improving decisions by systematic learning from experience, and the development and applications of performance measures for managing and evaluating transportation systems. His lecture this evening is entitled When Forecasting Fails, Making Infrastructure Decisions in an Uncertain World. Please join me in welcoming the 2017 Martin Wachs Distinguished Lecturer, Joseph Schofer, to UCLA.
It was such a long introduction, I'm dying to hear what I have to say. Thank you very much, Brian. I'm honored to be here with you. I'm delighted to be giving a lecture in the name of my dear friend and colleague of a lot of years, and I'm not going to get into the statistics. So from my point of view, this is not just another lecture. This is me giving the Martin Wachs Lecture. We have a relationship that goes way back, I've said that. It's a little bit, more than a little bit intimidating to be here on your home turf with this group of supporters and survivors. It reminds me of your immeasurable impact on ideas in transportation planning, transportation policy, transportation finance, and more importantly, and we've had the opportunity to talk together about this, your legacy, which is a group of people who've studied under you in multiple universities and gained so much from your not only your teaching, but your mentoring and your care. And you've done the same thing for me. And what I remembered, I'm looking at Helen and saying, I knew you before I knew my wife. And I spent a lot of time in your home, and I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful to be back with you. So you've given to me as well as you've given to the community. Donald Shoups asked me today, have you given this lecture before? And what I said was I haven't even heard this lecture before. When I got the invitation, it occurred to me that I could pull something off the shelf and talk about that, but I didn't want to do that for you because I need to deliver. And Martin said to me, his reputation depends on this talk. So I'm going to really try to do a good job. I want to talk about forecasting. And for those of you that build your career on travel forecasting and transportation forecasting, I'm not here to offend you or to insult you, and I'm not going to say anything that undermines forecasting. I don't intend to do that. But we do rely very heavily on forecasting to support design and planning and finance of infrastructure investments. And I'll talk mostly about transportation, but my interests go beyond transportation. Still, there are a lot of errors in forecasting, sometimes leading to what people call shortfalls, or I'll call long falls in prediction of cost and utilization, performance and impacts. So forecasts don't always get it right. And when forecasts don't get it right, there's a risk that a project won't fulfill the objectives that have been set for us. One of the things that occurred to me is there a risk that a project won't deliver the relationship between benefits and costs that decision makers expect. However, it's my opinion that it's the rare decision maker that looks at a project after it was implemented and asks or is even interested in the question of what's the relationship between benefits and costs. I'm not sure that's the most important outcome. In this discussion, what I want to talk about a little bit is these errors, but other people in this room know more about this than I do, and there's been a lot of research on that, so I don't want to repeat that. I want to talk a little bit about the causes of these errors, but I want to focus on, if you will, what we can do in a situation where we don't always get it right. And first, I want to start with a definition, because it troubled me to think about errors in forecasting, because the difference between what we forecast and what happens is really not always an error, and we shouldn't beat ourselves over the head for making errors in a situation where maybe we don't understand everything there is to know, or everything that's important about the dynamics of human behavior. We learn more all the time, but there's still more to learn because people are very complex, and people are changing because the situations they're in are changing. I don't want to call them errors because in a lot of cases, decision makers are really playing a different game than we're playing as planners and analysts and designers. And they may pick an outcome or pick a forecast that fits a particular need for them. It's different than what we might have recommended. And so what I tell my students is, try to do the best job you can, but that kind of a mismatch is not your fault. And also there are things happening in the world out there, and there's, you know more about some of these things than I do. Changes that are going on right now that literally make it impossible to forecast what the future is going to be like. And I've had a number of conversations over the last 2 days with people in this room, and it's so easy to come up with examples of that. So I don't like the idea of calling the difference between what we predict and what happens an error. I might call it a mismatch or a discrepancy or a gap or a disparity, and try to be neutral about that, because it's not always something that we can do something about. And these mismatches have been studied by a lot of people. I think about Don Pickrell, who really started in this business, Dan Fluberry, who was your student and who was here and gave the first of these lectures and is probably the most prominent person in the world. Martin, you've written about this, and I've mostly read what you've written, maybe not all of it. Ken Button has done some interesting work. Ryan just handed me a summary of a dissertation by Carol Voulgaris. Is Carol in this room?
No, she's in Seattle.
Well, she should be in this room, but there's nothing I can do about it. But apparently she's doing a dissertation on this that I was not aware of, so I will do my best to steal her slides so that I can use that if I ever give this talk again. Many people have looked at this, and let's see. So I can show some old data, very old data that comes from Fluberg, that shows a mismatch between predicted costs of highway and transit projects. The preponderance of project outcomes are on the negative side, which says we're underestimating costs. It's not news, but there's been a lot of work on this. I'm not going to try. I will not spend time on that. Still, and the evidence is things are getting better. Are they getting better? Well, one of the pieces of evidence I got was that this is from Ken Button, and if you stare at this long enough, and I'm not expecting you to do that, the zero line is here. That is, these are a difference between reality and a forecast. And what you see is the overestimate of ridership, which is the little triangles that are coming down towards zero, and the underestimate of costs are coming down up towards zero. So that's very encouraging. Still, there are issues. There are problems. One of the projects that I've been tracking over the last few years is the Honolulu area rapid transit. And I'm doing that because, and I think some of you are aware of this, one of my former students, who is Panos Brevaduras, is on the faculty of the University of Hawaii, and he's my source on this, and he's not completely unbiased because I believe once, if not twice, he's run as mayor in opposition to the heavy rail system. Okay, so he's an interesting source, but the cost numbers are reasonably up to date. And what you can see is from the initial cost estimate to the most recent 2017, there's been a 117% increase in costs. I'm not going to dwell on why, but there has been that. One of the poster children for an underperforming system is this Tidewater light rail system. I had a student in my class last fall who lived in Norfolk and explained to me that the problem is that this doesn't start anywhere or go anywhere, and so the ridership tends to be fairly low and declining. It's not, things are not getting better, they're getting worse. A lot of times people argue, well, it's a late bloomer, the demand will come along, and maybe it will. The evidence on this is not particularly favorable. So I want to consider some of the classes and consequences of these mismatches. And and it's very obvious from what I've said. So I can look at costs on the top line and utilization on the lower line. And the box on the left is overestimation. So overestimation of cost, it's not a good thing, but it's not. People don't die from that. That's not the worst thing that can happen if the system comes in at a lower cost than you estimated. But an underestimation of cost, the box in the upper right, that is a problem. In the case of utilization, an overestimation of utilization in the lower left-hand box is a bigger problem than an underestimation. An underestimation might mean that the system is crowded, but I think a typical transit operator might declare victory and say people really like this, and probably should declare victory. And the spiral of death comes when you have both of these. You have an underestimation of costs, so costs go higher, need more money to pay for it, and an overestimate of ridership, so you don't have the revenue stream that you expected. You might call that a perfect storm. So public and private sector respond to these kind of gaps in different ways. So why talk about private sector? Well, frankly, there's been a lot of talk in the political world in the last 3 months, or 6 months really, about privatization and use of private money for public sector projects. And we could talk more about this at the end of the talk. I don't want to dig much into that. But private sector, generally speaking, tends to be more cautious about these projects and the financial side than public sector. And my theory on that is that when you're talking about a private sector project, there's some identifiable person or entity who's got real money in the game, who's got skin in the game, as opposed to a public sector project where, yes, it's our money, but it's much harder to say, well, it's coming out of your pocket. The loss is coming out of your pocket. But private investor is sitting there saying, I stand to lose money. So it tends to be very cautious. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Private sector also, I would argue, finds it much easier to walk away from a project that's incomplete but is not going well. And I'll show you some examples of that. Public sector, on the other hand, is in a situation where once you start a project, it's very hard politically to walk away. So let me talk for a couple minutes about the causes of some of these errors. And I would classify them in this way. In some cases, and I said errors, so I should punish myself and not say errors, just say mismatches. Sometimes there's an internal technical cause, a modeling mistake. The data aren't right. The specification isn't right. There are better models that we can use. And there may be better models, but they're not in front of us yet. So research and investment in better data can really help in that. And if you look at the history of travel forecasting over the last 20 or 25 years, the methodology has changed immensely. It's gotten much more sophisticated. We're using better data all the time. And so we are driving down those errors, and that's very encouraging. I would anticipate that it's not a calculus process. That is, we will not get infinitely close to zero in errors. We will not drive them to zero. And the reason is that there are a lot of external causes for this mismatch. And the main one, I would say, is incorrect assumptions or incorrect forecasts about what the context is going to be like, what the world is going to be like in 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years from that. If you look at the construction side of projects, it's not at all unusual for a surprise to occur once construction starts. This is a picture of the construction of the Boston subway, which is, as I understand it, was the first subway in the United States. It's a picture from 1895, and if you saw a very recent PBS special on construction of this subway, one of the first problems they ran into was they opened up the ground and discovered an ancient cemetery that nobody anticipated. And it's a problem you can solve, but it caused huge delays and a large cost increase. Now, when I was thinking about the surprises that occur in construction, I went to some of my colleagues in geotechnical engineering, because a lot of times the surprises are below the ground. So you open up a hole in the ground and there's a utility there that you didn't know about, or a cemetery, or some natural condition. And what my colleague said to me was, well, you can begin to solve that problem with better data. You can do more borings. You can find out what's down there. But you will never drive it to zero because there's always going to be something. The one thing that's just happened in the news is that the tunnel boring machine that's making the replacement for the Alaska Way in Seattle just finished. And I won't get the numbers exactly right, but it's about a year and a half late because there was a failure of the technology. There were surprises underground, things that were very difficult to anticipate. Also, there are unanticipated changes that occur in resource availability. So this is the data stream of the price of regular gasoline from 1994 on. And there have been some real excursions. So you took me last night, Marty, on the excursion where we drove down, I think it was Olympic Boulevard, and found two gas stations that were $2 apart per gallon in terms of fuel. And that affects people's purchasing power, it affects their behavior. That's an anomaly. This was something that many of us experienced, and it was not much predicted, and there were projects that were changed in their nature because of that excursion. Also, there are, and I think people know a lot about these, there are gaps and mismatches that occur because of changes in scope. Examples of projects. The big dig in Boston, that, what was it, $16 billion project, which didn't start out at $16 billion. The Honolulu rail system has had some changes in scope. I think the San Francisco Bay Area East span replacement had substantial changes in scope. And I would argue they're externally caused. They're almost impossible to predict. In a lot of cases, they're good because somebody discovers an opportunity. Somebody presents a need that we didn't think about before. Maybe we should have thought about it, and we change the project, and it costs money. But it still leads to a gap, a mismatch in what we expected. Sometimes a technology comes along that completely changes the world. This is a slide that shows the development of the portable phone, the cellular, the wireless phone. And I hadn't seen this before, but the picture on the upper right probably isn't accurate. I don't think anybody was wearing a phone as a hat, but the picture in to the left of that is accurate, that people did have walk-around phones like that. It's a lot different than the phone that you have, I'm sure, and it's a lot, and the phone that you have now is very capable. If you look at the way people are using this device, which was extremely hard to anticipate, really impossible to anticipate, you would not have been able to predict that no matter what you did. There is a quote here that actually I came from a book by Richard de Neufville, which says that in the 80s, McKinsey and Company was hired by AT&T to forecast the growth of the mobile market. They estimated that the annual sales would be about 900,000 in 1999, and at that point in time, they were selling 900,000 wireless phones every 3 days. Similar to the forecast of the utilization or the market for large-scale digital computers, where I believe the president of IBM said, "I think I can sell 2 of them," and that market has exploded. There's a volatility that we're dealing with that's really very difficult to anticipate. This is particularly interesting to me because it turns out that the major entity that tracks the use of cellular phones and cellular or wireless service solely as opposed to wired service is the Centers for Disease Control. And the reason they track it is they do a lot of survey research, and cellular phones are a big problem in telephone surveys. If you look carefully at this, a little bit hard to see, but this is by age group. So the youngest age group is at the top, the oldest age group, I'm down here someplace. This shows the scale in years and the percentage of households that have only wireless service, no wired service. And what you see is it's pushing 50-60%. That changes the way people behave. It changes the way they use transportation. It certainly changes our access to them in survey research. This is the productivity of ride-sharing services. in Manhattan. So I think people know that the only reliable source right now of utilization of these ride matching services is in New York City. Productivity of I think this is data for Uber, but I'm not sure about that. On a per vehicle basis, has crossed over taxis in a number of years ago. One of the more interesting patterns that I've seen is this data that comes from Federal Highway Administration. It's the annual vehicle miles of travel, the trend over, what is it, that starts in 1991, and it's really going to go out to 2017. And that was the pattern that we saw, and it was a continuously growing pattern. And as time progressed, there was that dip, and I had a lot of colleagues and former students who saw that dip and said the bicycles are taken over, people are giving up cars, the future of the automobile is finished. Partly that was the recession, and that made a lot of difference. But those people are backtracking now and trying to explain why the pattern has come back up. Maybe that long-term growth pattern is what to expect in the future, but the position that I'm taking is it's really hard to anticipate the future because there's a lot of stuff that goes on that confuses the situation. I wanted to say something about visionary design and visionary planning. And this is a conversation, Marty, that you and I had yesterday, and you used the word planning, and I choose to use the word visionary thinking. That is, there are a lot of projects that come out into the marketplace or that come into the idea forum that are the visionary ideas of interesting people. And it's very difficult in a forecasting situation to go against that because you're dealing with somebody that has a really firmly held vision, who's really committed to a particular idea. And so what do we have here? We have in the upper left Hyperloop, which is kind of still on the on the list. It's the Elon Musk idea. I talked the other day in my class about Schweeb, which is right here. How many of you have ever heard of that? So I had exactly the same experience in my class, and I was really surprised that nobody. So this is an idea that came out of Google, and probably it's an indication of what happens when you have more money that you know what to do with, and more time to spend on it. Because this was a bicycle-powered elevated system that was proposed by employees of Google. The point of showing you this is to say sometimes there's really cool ideas out there that you can't anticipate, but that are a break from the pattern that we're doing right now, and they might work, and they might not work. So you can look at these pictures and answer for yourself which ones are have floated out in the environment and are gone, and which ones have stayed. So the Brooklyn Bridge was an extraordinarily visionary project in the 1880s, and last I looked, it's still there, and it's been quite successful. Moult Taylor's Aero Car, which is in the center, that was really a flying car. If you paid attention to the transportation discussions in transportation technology over the years, there's now yet another flying car proposal that's coming out of, I believe, MIT. And I'm not showing all those slides here, but I have a slide for another talk I've given, which is only pictures of designs for flying cars. So for those of you that are old enough that remember, particularly men, going to the barber shop and waiting to get your hair cut, and there was a Popular Mechanics magazine on the table, and that's where you would find the literature on flying cars. Those were the breakthrough ideas. Flying cars were proposed around 1915, 16, 17, 18, and there have been multiple models, and every 3 to 5 years there's a proposal that says this is going to solve the problem. And we could talk about why it's not, but I would take the strong position that it's not. Why talk about this? The reason to talk about this is sometimes somebody has a vision that says, I think this town needs heavy rail transit. And if that person has the energy and the influence, you may move ahead on that, and your forecast and my forecast may say that may not be a good investment. But it may go ahead. And that could well be what you're seeing in the Honolulu situation, and probably some of the light rail investments in the United States. The vision can sometimes outweigh our forecasts in the decision process. And if there's a good piece of news in this, it may be that if you're working with a visionary decision maker who's really committed to an idea, you may be able to get her or his attention because they're focused on that. And that may be an opportunity to talk about what might be a more realistic forecast. But sometimes you run into a situation like this that leads you to a failure in forecasting, and you may not be able to do much about it. So what do you do in the face of these mismatches? Well, the obvious thing to do is do better forecasting, to do research on forecasting, to develop better tools. And I've said that, and we've been doing that for several decades, and we've made a lot of progress. In the end, and maybe there's somebody that wants to debate me on this, but in the end, I would take the position that forecasting, no matter how good the model is very much dependent on extrapolation. That is, I'm looking at what happened in the past, I'm constructing an analytic model, and what's happened in the past informs the future. And the problem arises when the future isn't like the past. And some of these changes, the external changes in particular that I'm talking about, put us in a situation where the future is not like the past. So yes, we should continue to do research on modeling. We should continue to do a better job of collecting data, and the data sources are different and better than they have been in the past. But that alone, I think, will not solve this problem. Another thing that people talk about, I've spent some time, as I was thinking about this talk, communicating with some of my colleagues and some of my former students in the industry, and a common approach to forecasting in a situation, especially where private sector money is involved, is to do what's called an investment grade forecast. And I was a little bit skeptical about investment grade forecasts because I thought it was smoke and mirrors. And it is some smoke and mirrors, but mostly what it really amounts to is just doing a lot better job of doing that forecast, of looking at the risks and the threats that are out there that will really put us in a difficult situation. So investment grade forecasts typically mean getting better data. Very often, an investment grade forecast is done for a project that's going to be bond financed or equity financed, where investors want some security. They want some assurance that they're going to get their money back. And so that's a motivation to collect more data. And one of the typical additions to the data collection process is a stated preference survey, in particular to find out how people respond to tolls. And I think the presumption here is that people are going to respond to tolls differently in different settings, and I wouldn't be too sure that would be the case. Also, investment grade forecasts look specifically at particular external threats that could make cause a project to fail. And typically, what will happen is that a simulation will be run, the simulation meaning not just travel forecasting, but doing multiple tests with multiple threats to look at the possible distribution of outcomes. And you see that in the graphic on the right, where the green side is we're going to break even and make money, and the red side is where we're going to lose money on this. And what are the dependencies? The dependencies have a lot to do with what's really driving a demand for this project. So a project where the demand is driven by assumptions about economic growth are higher risk than a project where the demand is driven by, let's assume conditions stay as they are. So yeah, that is, if you're betting on that growth, the risk is higher. Projects that are built in greenfield settings are more risky than brownfield settings. The argument there being the future is going to be like the past. And I can understand what the past is in a brownfield situation and not in a greenfield situation. So what I'm telling you is, well, is this an accurate way to do forecasting? No, this is a way that you can go to the money market and say, I've looked at these possibilities, and I can take the information that I learned from that and give you a better estimate of what the confidence is that you're going to get paid back. Equity investors tend to be willing to take a higher risk, because that's what equity investors are, than a bond buyer. So bond buyer really is looking for very high confidence that the money's going to come back and will be paid back. Another thing that investment grade forecasts look at is the ability to adjust tolls on a revenue generating facility, tolls or fares. And what does that mean? It means, well, if things aren't going well, can we raise the price? And there are settings and there are contexts and there are agreements which lock in a toll that put some cap on that. And that's a little bit scary for an investor. If I can raise the price as much as I need to raise it, I'm going to feel better about that. You should keep in mind, if you're thinking skeptically about this, that I am not in the position of selling bonds. I'm describing how people do investment grade forecasting. They also look at the financial stability of an organization. So if you want to think about contemporary situations, one of the high risks for an investor is a situation where the administration of a governmental entity may change. And I think we're fairly close at hand to a situation where we're seeing an administrative change where the playing field has changed, and it puts a different risk on the table. I don't need to spend time on this other than to say, well, this is a little bit more, these are a little bit more specifics that come from the Fitch rating service, which is one of several rating services that raise bonds. So I've really covered all that. Investment grade forecasts don't eliminate the risk. What they do is they highlight the risks, and they end up they come out with a bond rating, a rating for bond sales, which are classified, if you look at the classification in detail, investment grade and everything else. And investment grade is a really specific meaning. Investment grade means these are safe enough that a bank can buy that kind of a bond. Anything below that, you and I might buy it, well, you might buy it, but a bank won't buy it because it needs a higher level of security. And where does that come from? It comes from digging in, looking at the possibilities, but it doesn't drive the risk to zero. And so what you're really seeing here is a deep dive into awareness of the risks, ways to control, and what are the options for adaptions. How can I recover if things don't go well? And if I can't recover, then the rating goes down, and people are much less willing to lend money for these kinds of projects. Another option for improving forecasts, which Marty Wachs has written about and others have written about, is grounding. Grounding a forecast to some element of reality. And I would argue that the father of these ideas is Daniel Kahneman, who's in the upper left picture. And his co-author, who passed away at a very young age, Amos Tversky, is next to him. And Kahneman, in his recent book, which is Thinking Fast and Slow, which really summarizes his body of work over 40 or 50 years, distinguishes in project planning and project management between an inside view and an outside view. And what he says is the inside view is the view of the project proponents, which tends to be optimistic. I'm excited about this project. I want it to move ahead. I'm going to be optimistic about my expectations for costs and for the revenue stream or for the benefits. And the outside view is a view that says, what have other people experienced when they tried to do the same thing? What can I learn from that? And this reminded me of a colleague that I had a number of years ago. He passed away. He was a sociologist. And we would sit around and talk about relationships, and how we were doing with our significant others. And we would complain about how things were going. And my friend said to me, the way to judge how things are going is answer the question, what's the best anybody has ever done in a situation like this? And is it perfection? No, it's not perfection. What Kahneman is saying is, look at what's happened in other cases. And if you're assuming that your case is going to be much, much better than another case, maybe you ought to step back and rethink that. And now I'm putting a different label on that, and I'm calling that grounding. Grounding, connecting to a reality and what someone else has experienced. And where I'm going with this is I want to put that in the category of evidence-based decision-making. So I have a dream, I want to build a house or a water supply system or a transportation system, and I have ideas about what the market's going to be, or the performance, and what the cost is going to be. Let's try to ground that by looking at what somebody else has experienced, if I can find a similar project. And that's this outside view. Fluberg, in his book, Mega Projects and Risks, talks about that. You've written about that, Marty. And you've talked about what people call a reference class forecast. That is, let's find a group of projects that are similar to my project and use that as a springboard for, or a baseline for comparison to see how my project, to set my expectation for my project. The challenge is to find that reference class, to find data on other projects that we can argue are really similar. And again, I would use the term anchoring. I want to anchor to those other projects and see what I'm doing, and see how well I'm doing. The plan is in that purple box. What's the best others have done? Which cases match my cases? What is that distribution of outcomes for those cases? And how can I adjust my forecast to some kind of reality? This is a bit of a stretch, but these are cost estimates for the construction of the new locks, the third set of locks on the Panama Canal. And these are in billions of dollars, and 3 contractors. $3.22 billion, $4.28 billion, and $5.98 billion. Well, there's a bit of a spread. The numbers look really small, but there's a bit of a spread there, from $3 billion to almost $6 billion. Big difference in cost estimate. Recently, this contracting organization's consortium got the contract. They were the low bidders. They got the contract. Okay. The reason I put this in front of you is that the people who made the decision, the Panama Canal Authority, had those other 2 bids. And they found that what they had was an indication that 2 other contractors who had been pre-selected as being qualified to do this said it was going to cost a lot more, $1 billion more, $2 billion more. And the current estimate of the cost overrun is about $2.2 billion, which makes them the second highest bidder if that cost overrun holds. And I think it's reasonable to look at that and say, well, this is a kind of a model of an anchored forecast. You're anchoring to other forecasts, so maybe that's a limitation. But there are people out there who are credible people who are saying it's going to cost you a lot more. And a reasonable question to ask is, why would they take that lowest bidder cost without negotiation? Well, they were lowest bidder. They wanted the lowest bidder cost. And I would take the position that the time frame in which this decision was made, which was at a point in time when there was a worldwide recession, the Panama Canal Authority was really looking for a low cost. They wanted the least expensive way to do this. So that really appealed to them. And they had a bid from a contractor who was desperate to get the work because they didn't have a lot of other work. And so they bid low, and I think they came into the game thinking, we'll come in with a cost overrun and we'll make up that difference. And they will. The locks are built, the locks are functioning. They're going to have to come to some kind of a negotiation. But this, to me, is an example of an opportunity to anchor a forecast, which was an opportunity missed. And I would take the position that, I am taking the position that this is, as I said, evidence-based decision-making. Let me find evidence out there on what other people either think or what other people have experienced. Evidence-based decision-making. So it turns out that right now there's a congressional commission called the Federal Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking, which I discovered 6 or 8 months ago. And my thought was, what a terrific idea, evidence-based decision-making. Isn't that what we all do? And it turns out that it looks like it isn't what we all do. What's particularly interesting is that this is also called the Ryan Murray Commission. And Ryan is a guy named Paul Ryan. I think he's the Speaker of the House right now. And it was his idea to start this research effort, and he was paired with Patty Murray from the state of Washington. So kind of an odd pairing when you look back at it from today's perspective. And the whole point of the Commission on Evidence-Based Decision-Making was to think through ways to use administrative data to do program evaluation. So administrative data, the program evaluation they're looking at was social programs, okay? And the administrative data described who was coming into the programs and also outcomes. And it was on file. So the idea was not to collect new data, but to use the data that was already there. And this commission, actually, I had at the annual meeting of the TRB, the executive director of this commission talked to the task force that I chair, because I thought, well, this was going to be an opportunity to think about the kinds of things I'm talking to you about today, which is let's learn from all the experiences that we've had before. Let's do evidence-based decision-making. My suspicion is, under the current administration, that the outcome of the Federal Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking is probably dead. I doubt that's going to go anywhere. But when I think about it, and I think about evidence-based decision-making, it's what people taught me scientists do. And in a sense, we who do research in this field are scientists. We have a different market, and our laboratory's in a different place. But it's what we do or what we really should do. And the question that I'm left with is, so how can we make better use of that? How can we learn better from what other people have done? So the Ryan Murray Commission, I think, may not be the be-all and the end-all. It's not going to give us a model that's going to make a difference, but there's some really interesting stuff that's going out in the world that's in a different part of the world than we're in. And to me, one of the most famous is the Cochrane Collaboration, which is really not well known outside the medical field. But Cochrane Collaboration is, I would describe it as a loose confederation of people in medical research around the world who have an agreement among them to produce evidence-based information, produce the evidence, to make that evidence accessible, to advocate for evidence, and to build an effective and sustainable organization. So those are their goals. For those of you what's really going on here in the Cochrane Collaboration is not a bunch of people who all work for the same organization. It's a bunch of people around the world who are involved in medical research and looking at the efficacy of various treatments and various interventions, who've agreed to share data, who've agreed to work together. So, and what's really behind this analytically is meta-analysis. So meta-analysis is bringing together data from a variety of different studies to amplify the impact of that data, to have, instead of having a bunch of tiny data sources, to have a bunch of tiny data sources that we all pool and analyze together. And if you look carefully at their logo, that logo is kind of a standard statistical presentation of meta-analysis, of bringing data together, where each of the studies may not be statistically significant, but when you pool them, you begin to see that there's a preponderance of evidence in one direction or another. It turns out this is a really interesting source of medical information, and it was a grassroots kind of organization. Every time I look at this, I think maybe this is the kind of thing we ought to be thinking about in infrastructure planning and in transportation planning in particular. Can we bring that information together that we learn from lots of different activities around the world? Now, the Cochrane Collaboration, because it's focused on medical research, is really dependent on random controlled trials, RCT. Random control. Okay, so what's random controlled trials? Random, first of all, means I'm going to select the sample randomly so that I know I don't have bias, or have confidence that I don't have bias, that there's going to be a treatment group and a control group, and they're the same because I selected them randomly. So you might think about this, in the application here, is medical treatment. So I have a pill that cures baldness, okay? And I'm going to select bald people and randomly assign them to the treatment group and the control group, and one gets a placebo and one gets the the medication we're testing. So that's the randomness. The control is I've got a control group and a test group, and I do a trial with that and see what happens. And that's a very standard approach in laboratory research, and particularly in medical research. The point of Cochrane Collaboration, it was to pull together a lot of small studies and try to find something that was a more powerful result. It turns out, if you think about it for about 30 or maybe a half a second, I can't really do random controlled trials in the implementation of light rail transit in suburban areas, all right? Because I can't do random, and it's very hard to do control. Still, there's an opportunity to learn. There's an opportunity to look at cases and bring cases together, codify that, and what I'd really like to do is file them someplace where every one of us that wants to ask a question, how well is this going to work in my town, can reach to those cases and pull them in and look at them and either analytically or qualitatively decide that there's something useful from which we can learn. And it turns out that in transportation, there are 3 or 4 examples. We've really tried to do this, and we made a little bit of progress, and those examples are all dead right now. So you have to be really old, and so a few of us in the room qualify, to remember that in the 70s, there was a document that was published by the federal government called Characteristics of Urban Transportation Systems. Do you remember that? Yes, you must be really old. Okay. And that's the cover of it. I have it in my library. You probably have it in your library. Okay. What is it? It's a collection of data that says, well, this is what it costs to build heavy rail transit under these circumstances. So it was just cost data. It was in a table. There was nothing analytic about it. There was nothing sophisticated. But if you wanted to get a rough idea of what it cost, you could see that, and you could see the range. Here are different cities, and here are the costs. The sample size is grossly small, and it's so far out of date that you couldn't possibly use it. But the idea was an interesting idea. On the right is a series. So Bob, you know about this. The series, the Transit Cooperative Research Program, TCRP. The series was at 95, which is a multi-volume study, and the title is Traveler Response to Transportation Change. So it was lots of studies brought together in one place that said, well, you know, when they raised the fare on this system in this place, here are the range of responses that they got. So if you were in some isolated place and you had no other source of information, but thank God you were in touch with TRB, you could reach out to that and say, here's the way to predict what's going to happen. Here's what, because it's evidence. It's what happened in other places. So for the few of you that might care, the PI on this project was Dick Pratt. And I brought Dick Pratt into my TRB task force also to do a show and tell and say, this is what happened in it. This is finished. We're not doing this anymore. And the problem that you have with a source like that is it gets old really fast because the world is changing. People are different. The stimuli are different, and so it quickly goes out of the picture. There's another example, which is even older than this, and it's the UMTA, I have to explain this, UMTA SMD program. UMTA is, so you've heard of the Federal Transit Administration, should have heard of that. The predecessor agency was the Urban Mass Transit Administration, UMTA. And they, in the, God knows when, I can't even get the date on it, they had a program called Service and Methods Demonstration. And they actually tried to do, they didn't do random RCT, they couldn't do randomized controlled experiment, but they used statistics of quasi-experimental design to evaluate different innovations in transit service. And there's a volume of documents like this, also on my shelf, that brought that information together. Oh, that was a sign that I should probably stop because the microphone fell off. We'll see if we can make this work. Far out of date, but the idea is an interesting idea. The most recent idea along these lines is a requirement in the Tiger Grant program. So the Tiger Grant, Tiger stands for Transportation Investments Generating Economic Recovery. So Tiger Grants really came along about the time of the recession. It was a way to pump money into transportation. And somebody got the really clever idea that if you wanted money for a Tiger Grant project, first of all, you had to do planning and analysis and predict what the relationship between benefits and costs were, which was I have to say, not generally required in other kinds of programs, but they wanted people to study this and plan for this. But more important, the Tiger Grant program had and has, because it's still in effect, a requirement for ex post analysis that you had to do before and after analysis. When you look at the requirement, I think a reasonable person has to say, this is great, because we're going to learn something from all these projects. And there were all kinds of different projects in the Tiger Grant program. The only limitation was the Tiger Grant program had no money for ex post evaluation. So they said you had to do it, but you have to pay for it yourself. So there's some really good ex post evaluations, and there's some really, we bought red buses and we got red buses and they were very red, and that was it. And it didn't go anywhere. But the idea is a really interesting idea. The sad part about the Tiger Grant program is that in the current administration, that's slated for termination. Okay. So, and I'm not thinking so much about, the grant program is important. What's important is there was an opportunity to learn something and to build a basis for evidence-based decision making. Now, one of the conversations I've had here in the last couple of days was to talk about, was a discussion about, so how do you know what happened after? How do you get that information? And I would say that generally speaking, there are really only two groups that that are moderately consistent at following up on projects and answering the question, what really happened? And they are scholars, people like you, people who do doctoral dissertations, who say, I wonder what happened in this project, and go out and dig up the data. And that's extremely valuable and important. And journalists. And especially in this day and age, it seems to me we really ought to be thankful for journalists who are really serious about digging into those things. Because from what I see nationally, the big national papers, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times in particular, are very good at occasionally digging into some project and saying, did it really work? Or how did it really work? And my experience in Chicago is those journalists very often will come to academics and say, can you help me do this? Can you help me figure out how to determine that? I think it's so important to ask those questions. And the evidence is, and there was just a recent National Academy study that came out, and I have it in my briefcase, but I don't remember the title of it, that talked about ex post evaluation and specifically addressed the notion that, by and large, policymakers don't want to do that. And why they not want to do it? Because they'd rather spend the money on building than answering the question, did the last thing I built work? And the other reason, which is very logical, is I really don't want to know how it turned out as long as nobody comes after me. And that's really a problem. It cuts off learning, cuts off opportunities for that. Even the smallest piece of information like that gives us an opportunity to do reference anchored forecasting. I want to anchor it to some project. I had a student a number of years ago who did a little project that used case-based reasoning. So this is just another name for the same thing. So I know you're very impressed with this drawing because I put it together myself, and it has deep meaning for me. But imagine that you can characterize the project in which you have an interest in, I'm going to do 3 dimensions because I'm really bad at doing 4 dimensions in a 2-dimensional slide. I'm moderately good at doing 3 dimensions in 2-dimensional slide. But suppose I'm looking at some transportation investment and I characterize it by the length and the type of project, which might be a bus project or a rail project, and or maybe that's the mode and the project type is long or short or fat or slim or something like that. And each of those purple blobs represents a project that's out there. And if I want to answer a question about, what's going to happen with my project, which I put on that red blob kind of in the middle, it's really hard to learn anything because they're spread out all over the place. And what you hope and what you're looking for is a database that looks more like this. It says, I got 3 other projects. They're sort of like that. So maybe I can bridge between them and make a forecast. So this is a deep, dark secret associated with the SHARP program, the Strategic Highway Research Program, option 2. I brought this idea to the capacity committee in SHARP 2 when the question came up, how can we do forecasts of economic development impacts of transportation investments? And the answer was, well, we got a lot of sophisticated models, and the good people on that committee were largely practitioners, and they said, I have two problems with those models. I don't understand them, and I don't believe them. And so that's a problem, because even if the models are perfect, which they weren't, how do you convey that information to other people? And that becomes difficult. Okay. Case-based reasoning is a way to do that. And in fact, what we ended up doing was investing a lot of your money and my money into a series of projects that collected a lot of cases. And they came out under the name of TPICs. And TPICs stood for Transportation Project Impact Case Studies. Brought together 100 case studies and developed a fairly simple tool to use it really as a way of anchoring forecasts and predicting forecasts. And this is not TPICs. This is what TPICs morphed into when it moved over to AASHTO. It's called EconWorks. I'm on the advisory committee for that. And it has the same problem that TPICs had. And that is, you got to have a lot of cases to make it work. If you don't have a lot of cases, it isn't going to work that well. My sense is it's been very hard to convince people involved in this that the number of cases is really critical. Now, so we could do some. What can we do to bootstrap this process? Well, we can make forecasting better. I want to skip that slide. Yeah, well, what's that slide? That says if you only have a small sample, it's really hard to look at 3 or 4 or 5 cases and make a prediction. So you need a big sample to make that work. We'll come back to that. Let's go away from the notion of making forecasting better and say, so what happens when a project goes south? It's not working well. Well, if you look at it from the cost side, and especially when there's private money in it, there are things that can be done. On the public sector, so the Honolulu case is an interesting case. What did they do when they found out there was a huge cost overrun? The first thing they did was they went back to the federal government and said, can we have more money? Which was a very logical thing to do. And the federal government responded, no, which was also a very logical thing to do. And the next thing they did was they went back to the federal government and said, well, we want to like to cut back the length of the line because we haven't got enough money to build the whole thing. Okay? The federal government, the FTA said, you have a full funding grant agreement that says you're going to build this much. You can't cut back. And so now they're going back to tax the locals to get enough money to do that. Private sector project might work differently. Private sector project might more likely rely on a sunk cost accounting principle, or what economists sometimes call a bygones theory, which is, this project isn't going well, I'm going to stop. And I'm not going to mourn over the fact that I spent $2 billion on it before. I'm going to look ahead and say, I don't want to spend $2 more billion on it to go forward because it isn't going well. Is that common? No, it is not common. But the fact is that private sector investments in infrastructure do occasionally go bankrupt. And bankrupt it's a terrible outcome. Nobody's really looking for it. But bankrupt is survival. Bankrupt says, I'm going to get out of this project and I'm going to lose money and I'm going to live to fight another day, which is not really a bad idea. And here are 4 projects that I very easily found that were public-private partnerships, that were private investment, that went bankrupt. Pocahontas Freeway, which is in Virginia, San Diego South Bay Expressway, Texas State Highway 130, and one close to me, which is the Indiana Tollway. So what really happened? What really happened was they wrote down the value of these projects. They didn't default on bonds, but they ended up selling off the project to somebody else for a fraction of what they paid for. And the interesting thing about bankruptcy is that, especially in public infrastructure, is the project doesn't vaporize. So they build a bridge and it went bankrupt. The bridge is still there. It's the financial side that failed. It's not the physical side. And that's sort of encouraging. It's a way to get out. It's a way to survive. I'm not recommending it. I'm just saying, yeah, that's what people do when the money is a problem. This to me is a really interesting example. It's a telephone system called Iridium. Has anybody heard of Iridium? Yeah, okay. Do you have an Iridium phone? That's too bad. Iridium was a Motorola idea. They were going to put in 66 low Earth orbit satellites and create a a global wireless phone system, which seemed like a really good idea, although they didn't look out the window and see that cell phones were coming along really fast. And cell phones are completely different technology. They're based on ground-based technology. And Motorola spent $5 billion on that. And they were deep in the hole. It was a disaster. It was a huge, huge failure. It looked like such a good idea because you could be, I don't know that you'd want to be, but you could be on the Antarctic and you could call home, or you could call, Jimmy John's for a pizza, for a sandwich or something like that, because it was absolutely global. And what happened was it got sold off for $25 million, which is substantially smaller than $5 billion. And the current owner runs it, and they have multiple phone vendors, so you can go out and buy an Iridium phone, and for a lot of money. It's not cheap. And who buys it? Well, you and I don't buy it, but somebody that does need to be in Antarctica or on a ship or in some remote place buys it. The market isn't huge. The price is high, but for $25 million, it was a bargain. It was a good thing to do. Sometimes that works out when there's a financial problem. All right, and the last thing I want to talk about, I wonder what that is. Oh, we'll hold on that. The last thing I want to talk about is on the design side. So, problem with forecasting, we have a gap between what we expected and what happened. There are things we can do on the financial side, try to get more money, or get out of the business and put somebody else in it, and we probably don't lose the infrastructure in the process. It stays with us, and particularly if the infrastructure drops back into public ownership, which in a lot of these deals, that's what happens. The government has a different commitment to running the system than a private operator. A private operator was doing it for the money. Government is doing it because they want to give you mobility and want to provide accessibility to a place. So there's a social merit associated with that. On the design side, there are ways to deal with these kinds of risks of gaps in forecasting to get a product that's useful and secure and doesn't put you in a terrible risk situation. So I'm a little bit ahead on that slide. But so Martin, you and I talked about this yesterday, that people talk about robust designs. So you come up with a robust, what does that really mean? A robust design is whatever happens within reason, it's still going to be okay. It's not going to be optimal, but it's going to be okay. So you can think about that. And the idea of robustness is I really don't have to change anything. I still have it. It isn't perfect, but it works reasonably okay. And I could deal with that by simulating threats and saying, okay, well, I'm going to develop a design that works pretty well under a variety of circumstances. What's really more interesting is flexible designs for what I would call managed adaptability. So things don't go right. Let's see what changes I can make. Let me be an interventionist and change it. I can change the service characteristics. I can change pricing. I can change marketing. I can cut back the service or expand the service. Maybe the answer to that is we'll just build systems with excess capacity, and that might be a good idea. But the failure is not always in the direction of I got too much demand. It could be I have too little demand. So you have to be really careful about that. So one of the categories that I really thought about in the last couple of days was the flexibility of adaptive reuse. And so here are 3 examples of linear parks in places that I know, and I think many of you know. The High Line in Manhattan is on the upper left, an old railroad line that's now not only a really important recreational feature, but has been a huge kick for real estate prices there because people want to live near that. The 606 is in Chicago. That's the middle one. And that's had a similar but not quite the same effect. It's really not in the downtown area. And the other one is the one that I drive my bicycle on. It's near my house, and it's an old railroad line. All right, so nobody really thought about adaptive reuse, but there's a way to squeeze value out of these projects if you don't get the value that was originally intended. The other option is dual use designs. So this is an old historic example. So you people that lived in Chicago, you'll remember this. This is the Auditorium Theater. It's on Michigan Avenue. It's an Adler and Sullivan building in 1890. And it still exists, and it's a spectacular theater. It's been rehabilitated. So if you read the history of that building, when they built it as a home for the opera and for theater, and they knew that it was never going to survive financially as a home for the opera and the theater. So when they designed the building, they built a hotel and office space around it, and that was going to provide the revenue. So that was a really intentional dual-use design. So what's the connection to here? Well, if it doesn't work for one thing, maybe you can generate benefits in another way. This is another example. If you've been to the Netherlands and visited the Delta Works, which protects the Netherlands from severe storm surges, many of the protective facilities are multiple-use facilities. So the storm surge barrier gets used every 10 years, maybe. It's really an issue every decade or even less frequently. But in almost every case, they build a recreational facility there. So there's the inland side is to the right, and the ocean side is to the left. And that's a huge harbor and water recreational facility. So dual-use design got them some value that they wouldn't have had otherwise if they didn't think about it. So is there a connection? The connection is, to me, well, I predict the benefits coming from the storm surge protection, but I can get some other benefit out of that. And if there's never another storm, I still have that other benefit. There's another notion that, let me hold on that I want to use to kind of bring this to an end. And that is what I'm calling strategic incrementalism. So people talk about incrementalism in planning, and when I was a student, they talked about incrementalism as a bad thing. We really shouldn't be doing that. Except it's pretty much always what we do, so it can't be all that bad. But strategic incrementalism, to me, is thinking about what you might need to do in the future and being ready to do that, investing to do that. Another term for it is hedging. So what is hedging? I had a student who taught me this. Hedging means getting ready for something different to happen that you didn't expect to happen, and maybe putting some dollars against it so you are ready for it. We invest more at the outset to preserve future flexibility. And in the process, we monitor, we collect data, we watch what's happening, and we make a decision about whether or not to make a change. So if you know the financial industry, you should be able to recognize hedging as the application of real options. So what are real options? Well, what are financial options? So financial options are buy an option to buy a stock in the future at a certain price. And the expectation is you buy that for a relatively small price. You lock in that option, and your expectation is that the price of the stock is going to go above the price that it is now. So you bought that option, and you can make a deal on that stock. A real option is not buying, and the issue with financial option is it has a drop-dead date. So the financial option closes on July 15th. On July 15th, if you haven't converted that and bought the stock, whatever you paid for the option is gone. And it's just you bought it because you thought you could make money on it, and you didn't. In a real option case, you buy something physical, and you may not or may not exercise the option. That is, I bought the capability to do something. I may need to do it, or I may not need to do it, but I've locked in the possibility. And if the opportunity comes, if the need comes, then I can exercise. So we talk about the option price, what it costs to buy in and get that flexibility, and the premium or the exercise price, which is what it costs to convert that to something real. So that we might show that this way. So timeline is on the bottom. The purple bar represents what I call once and done investment. I invest in something at this point in time. And in the future, I need to do something else because I need more capacity, I need more storm protection. And that purple bar says that's what it costs. And the idea of real options is I invested a little bit more at the beginning to buy the capabilities so that if and when I have to expand, I can get that at a lower price. And I'll try to show you some examples of that. I think this is a really interesting way to think about planning and decision making under uncertainty. To buy ahead the flexibility to do something in the future. So can we find examples of that? Okay, so this is the Blue Cross Blue Shield building on Randolph Street in downtown Chicago. Two pictures of it, the old picture and the current picture. The building was built 33 stories high with the idea that structurally, and in terms of structure and foundation, they had the capacity to double the height if they needed it. Blue Cross Blue Shield, some decades later, decided they needed it. The current building is 57 stories high. And it's a little bit hard to see because they're not at the same magnification. But this is the same building, which is almost double the height. That was planned. The architects planned that, the owner planned that. Another example that people might be particularly familiar with, so people that spend time in New York, this is the George Washington Bridge between New Jersey and New York. And when it was built in 1931, it was built as a single-deck bridge, intentionally designed so that it could be expanded to a double-deck bridge. And that expansion took place in 1962. So that's what the bridge looks like now. Well, that's, to me, an example of real options. Might need to expand, not sure, build the capability to do it. A less successful option is this 25th of April bridge in Lisbon, Portugal, which was also double-decked after it was built. But it turns out that in order to do that, they had to add another set of suspension cables. So they could do it, but it wasn't quite as easy. So they didn't think that far ahead. I think this is a really interesting way to address the future if you can look ahead and see opportunities to do this. What does it really take? It takes thinking about these kinds of things. It takes an option, a case where you really have the possibility of doing this. This is a piece of work that I did with a PhD student a couple of years ago, where we're addressing a design problem. The question was storm surge barrier. We're thinking about New York. This is really a hypothetical example. What we're looking at is comparing what I showed before was a kind of once and done strategy where you build a barrier, you model you analyze the data that shows you the pattern of storm surge heights, and you build something to deal with that. And that really is represented by the product of this static strategy, which is this dashed line there. And the alternative is don't build all that at once. Build something less and collect data. Monitor, learn, and make a new decision. And the result of this dynamic strategy, which is a real option strategy, is that jagged line that goes up the top. So this is the size of the simulated storm surges, which exceed the height of this once and done barrier. And the model that we use is a model like this that said, okay, here was the old mean of the storm surge. Here's the most recent data that we've got. Let's weight those two together and get an estimate of what the new mean should be and make a new decision about whether to add the height. And we did a lot of simulation work here, and what we came up with was the notion that, well, there can be an advantage in kind of building and studying, learning, and going on from there. So what we're looking at is a strategy that looks something like this. Plan, implement, operate, monitor, learn, and decide. And what you may decide to do is nothing, or what you may decide to do is something, to add capacity, add capability, or not to do it at all. So don't overstep your ability to look at the future. So to make this a little bit more real, I wanted to show you this, what I consider to be a counterexample. So this is the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. It crosses the Chesapeake Bay. In Maryland, it's between, basically what it serves is a huge recreational flow between Baltimore and Washington, D.C. and the eastern shore of Maryland. So for those of you that have lived in Washington, if you live in Washington in the summer, and especially before everybody had air conditioning, which they had now, what everybody who could do it would do was they'd go to the eastern shore for the weekend. Everybody would drive over on Friday and come back on Sunday. They built the first bridge in 1952. They built a 2-lane bridge, and they predicted the demand out to 1970. In the summer of 1952, it was carrying the 1970 volume, and because it reduced the travel time so much that it was completely full. 1973, they built another bridge, and in their great wisdom, they built a 3-lane bridge so they could run it 2 lanes in one direction. Okay. And now they run them as one-way pairs. Mostly. So the right-hand bridge, the southern bridge, runs eastbound, and the other bridge runs westbound. Except it's so crowded that they run everything in the shorebound direction in the afternoon and I think they save one lane and run it the other way. And that, to me, I look at that and think, there's a case where real options would have made a lot of sense. Why don't you take the chance to build a bridge that has the capability to go double deck, to go wider, and not get in the situation where you have to keep building. It's a lot more expensive to build another bridge. And I don't know if you're tracking it, Bob, but there's a study that's going on in the state of Maryland looking at the idea of building a third bridge. And I'm just tempted to send a note and say, well, didn't you learn anything for the first 2 times? Maybe there's an opportunity to do a better job. So let me just say, raise the question, is this only about the growth in demand? And no, it really isn't. Because one of the things it says is, well, don't overinvest, because you may not need this. Is there anything coming down the road that might say, well, the need for transportation is maybe different than what you think now? If you think about self-driving cars, yeah, the need might be really different. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty about that. It'll be really interesting to follow that. And having that kind of flexibility is really an interesting idea. This is a newspaper story. It's an op-ed that appeared in the Seattle Times before Seattle voted on the $54 billion program to expand the transit system, the rail transit system. And what it says is, all this technology is coming along. You may find that your system is obsolete before you finish it. Well, they'll be able to stop it if it is obsolete. You have to be a little bit careful, because this was written by the CEO of INRIX, so it's really sort of on the automobile side of the house. Still in all, it's a warning and something to think about as you look forward. So what does it mean? What does all of this mean? And the first thing I come away with is, well, all the people that work on forecasting and do research on travel forecasting and cost estimation, that work is really important. I wouldn't stop a bit of it. Doing research on that is really productive. At the same time, don't expect that the gaps between predicted outcomes and reality are going to get really small, because the world is changing at a faster and faster pace. And those big sources of uncertainty, sources of risk out there are outside the transportation system. And we're not forecasting them, and I don't think we can forecast them. At the risk of getting more political, I'm reminded of a statement that the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, said somewhere years and years ago. And the bottom line was, well, what's really important is the unknown unknowns. And that's really what we're talking about, is the unknown unknowns. What's going to happen that we cannot think about right now, and how can we do a better job of being prepared? And I think design flexibility is really important. So for those of you that are not on the analytics side, not doing travel forecasting, but are interested in design and creativity and coming up with new ideas, what this says to me is that's really important. And we can come up with some clever stuff that will give us the flexibility that we need in the future. I don't want to back off of that. At the same time, I think we have to convey the notion of flexibility and adaptability and real options. Maybe I wouldn't use the term real options with the public and decision makers, because there really is a strong tendency, particularly among people like me, among civil engineers, who say, if I'm going to go out and build something, I'm going to build the biggest damn thing I could possibly build, and that's really what I need. And I think what you need to say is, let's try to be a little bit looser about this, a little bit more flexible to get what we really need out of the process. And in the end, to me, it's all about learning. Learn what your experiment did that informs my experiment. Learn what from the next thing I do to inform the thing that somebody else does after that. And that learning means collecting data, means analyzing, means looking at what happened, archiving those data, building our own, if you will, Cochrane Collaboration, where we assemble data on cases. And we need to keep doing it, because the cases that we studied 2 years ago or 10 years ago are dead. They're out of date. You've got to look at what's happening right now. I think there's a great future in that. I think it's really interesting. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk at you on this subject. So I'm done. Thank you very much. I'm glad to try to answer some questions. Yes.
My question is about some of the visionary projects that you mentioned at the very beginning of
Yes.
your presentation. I think the caption on top of that slide was, don't ignore the visionary projects. They can sometimes be of
Yeah.
of great consequence. So my question, I guess, would be, of course, is that if you have a visionary project, it's very difficult to do many of the evidence-based data collection techniques that you're talking about. So if you're a municipality, let's say, and you're trying to decide between essentially a mega project that is maybe visionary and would not be very conducive to the evidence-based collaborative efforts that you've described, versus something that is more of a red bus, as your example goes.
Yeah.
How do you know when it's a good idea to maybe kind of gamble on a project as opposed to just go with what the evidence
Well,
says?
I don't know what your role in the process is, but from where I'm standing, I'm probably not the one that's going to be the one who decides to gamble on it. Somebody else is some elected official may be willing to gamble on it. And I would say I would try to do the best I could to look at examples that are reasonably close. So I'll use a kind of a cheap example and say the flying car, which is best I understand it, I believe Uber is getting into looking at that and using drones to move people around. And I would look at other examples of stuff that went way before that may give me some notion, that may put me in a position to ask the question, why didn't that work? What were the barriers to make that work? So there may be a way to come up with an analog. I think if you were looking at something like a hyperloop, I think it's possible to step back and avoid Kahneman's planning fallacy or the inside view versus the outside view and say, so what are the steps it's really going to take to make that successful? What are the pieces that have to fall into place? So you may end up fragmenting that project and thinking about what are the costs likely to be? What are the cost trends, for example, in tunneling? And we have information on that. And what difference is it going to make if you're going to go whatever speed we can go with, say, the California high-speed rail and some project like that? Is that really going to take us someplace that's going to work? It's not an easy situation. It's not formulaic. But I think it could be insightful by looking at finding examples, not the whole thing, but pieces of that whole thing that might inform.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah. No more questions? Yes.
So I'm coming from policy world, California Governor's Office of Planning and Research, Wisconsin. Been looking at some highway project analyses from recent years, for some of the work we're doing, and finding that even in recent years, after years of research and court cases saying it has to happen, the induced travel from roadway projects has been, in these analyses, rated or stated to be zero, the output of the project. Obviously, that would make a cost-benefit analysis come out way wrong for the project if we did cost-benefit analyses for these sorts of projects, which we don't. I guess my question is there, do you see anything more that academia can do to get its work out into policy beyond what it already does? Because there's these kind of willful gaps in looking at research, looking at real phenomena that we know fairly well at this point, that mean billions of dollars.
I'm not sure that academia has full responsibility for these kinds of issues, but there are a few clever people in academia who probably have something to contribute. So I can think of a couple of things. So what we normally do is we publish, and what people who are more mature in the field may do is reach out to the media, because it's another way to get through to policymakers. It's another path. And you have to be careful about that, because I know a lot of academics that are scared to death to talk to media, and you really have to find somebody who's got the right ear and who has the capability to communicate and to write something that may be relatively more complicated. I think that's part of it. Another thing that you can do on your side is to reach out to people in the academic world. So if I had free license to deal with a problem like that, I might try to find opportunities, let's say, for you to bring that problem into the university. What we all really want is you to write a check for $300,000 so we do the research. But another thing you could do would be to come to a forum like this and say, here's an idea, here's what we've done, here's what we know, let's talk about that. And what do you know that's different than what I know? Because it's possible, and I'm not trying to typecast you, but it's possible that people in academia have the time and the opportunity to learn about a lot of things that you don't have the time and the opportunity to do. So that may be a way of getting that advice on the table. So the door needs to be open kind of in both directions. And I have a very high degree of optimism for California, and I come from Illinois, and I have a very low degree of optimism in Illinois for trying to get that information through. But I think there's a wealth of knowledge here that if we share could all benefit. And to me, as I see it, it's very much the same as when I think about the Cochrane Collaboration, or I think about archiving data from experiences. There's experiences here that you can absorb, and I don't think you should do it for free, but you could probably do it for free. Can I do one more? He doesn't want me to do one more.
Okay, quickly.
Okay, I'll try to make this quick. So I found the analogy to the Cochrane Collaboration very interesting. So this is the collaboration looking at sort of evidence-based medicine and trying to encourage better evidence-based decision-making. And so I'm not an expert in the field of medical sort of evaluation, but my understanding is a big problem there in the crisis of reproducibility, the crisis of sort of evidence-based medicine, is bias in what is entered into these meta-analyses. So the meta-analyses will take into account a set of studies, but that set of studies is biased towards successful studies.
Yeah, that's the historic problem in medicine has been that what gets published is the positive results. The negative results don't. My understanding is Cochrane Collaboration doesn't really work through publications. They don't work only through publications. They work through people, individuals in labs all over the world, and they have subgroups that say, well, we're working on an HIV vaccine. So a lot of people are doing that, and they're communicating really outside of the publication process, because the publication bias is it's very, very important. It's a critical issue. But the evidence that I see from Cochrane Collaboration is there are a lot of people in the medical field who feel that is really a very high standard in the product, and it's a group of people who are aware of the kind of publication bias that you're talking about. So once you're aware of it, it becomes a little bit easier to deal with.
So just a very quick follow-up, do you see a conceptual sort of analogy to publication bias in what you analyze in terms of project evaluation?
Yeah, sure, of course, because nobody wants to publish something that says this project is a turkey, because somebody from the California Department of Transportation might not like you for that, or might not put money into that. On the other hand, academics are more likely to do that than others. But that's why I refer to journalists, because for better or for worse, journalists really like to do that. And I think it's a service. I think it's really important. It's the emperor's new clothes kind of thing. Somebody needs to say that. But of course, yes, there's bias like that in it. Thank you very much. I am honored, and I appreciate the talk.